Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women who are reshaping our world. Now, as Europeans mark 80 years since the end of the Second World War, in this special edition we're focusing on the French women who were sent to a concentration camp for aiding the resistance. Ravensbruck, near Berlin, was the largest concentration camp the Nazis built for women. More than 120,000 prisoners passed through Ravensbruck, and it's estimated a quarter of them never made it home. This report by Claire Paquelin and Stephanie Trouard.
The last messages, written by prisoners before they were sent to concentration camps deep inside Nazi Germany.
They are little traces, because they only spent a few hours in here before being deported. But every word is a trace of someone, their journey, a trace of their survival.
More than 80 years later, the graffiti is still visible at the Fort de Romainville near Paris.
Here you have graffiti that always interests visitors here. It's a kind of German lesson. Knowing a few words in German in a concentration camp could help a prisoner save themselves.
In Nazi-occupied France during World War II, the Germans used the fort as a transit camp for prisoners, mostly women, arrested for being in the resistance.
There were women arriving who were devastated. Their lives had been upended. Some didn't know what had become of their children, and others, after long weeks and months of detention, had found resilience. There was solidarity. We can read it in the testimonies between women with higher morale and those with lower morale.
More than 3,000 women passed through here during World War II. 90% of them were later deported to the Ravensbruck concentration camp in Nazi Germany. Jacqueline was 17 years old when she was deported to Ravensbruck.
We felt like we were in a world of madness, of horror.
The Nazis had arrested Jacqueline and her parents because they were members of the resistance.
I joined the resistance very young because in my family we didn't accept at all, not at all, the presence of the Germans.
On August 15th, 1944, Jacqueline was put on the last train that left the Paris region for the concentration camps. Everyone on board hoped the train would be stopped in its tracks. The Allies had landed more than 2 months before on the beaches of Normandy and were closing in on Nazi-occupied Paris. But after 3 days travelling in wagons built for animals, Jacqueline arrived at Ravensbrück in Germany.
What happened when we arrived? It was a terrible shock for everyone, for each one of us.
Ravensbrück was the largest concentration camp the Nazis built for women.
It's hard to imagine, and it's very calm now, and it wasn't calm back then.
8,000 women from France, mostly resistance members, were deported to Ravensbrück. Alongside prisoners from several different countries, they lived in cramped barracks and were forced to labour in factories, making weapons and equipment for the German army. They worked 12-hour days in appalling conditions, surrounded by violent guards and with very little to eat or drink.
Let me see what we have here.
Despite the hardships they faced, the women would sneak out whatever they could from the factories to make each other gifts.
They carved very small objects, for example, from plexiglass, which was used for airplane cockpits. This is a fingering. It's very precisely carved around here. It could be worn only secretly.
If caught, the women faced severe punishment. One prisoner even dared to carve out a cross of Lorraine, symbol of free France.
And here we have a very French object also. You could consider this an act of resistance since it was forbidden and it was considered a form of a sabotage also.
The memory of the women prisoners was preserved by those who made it home, like Jacqueline. In life and death, they created unbreakable bonds.
They're more than sisters. I still can't find the word. I had comrades who I telephoned every day. Do you have many like that?
At 101 years old, Jacqueline is one of the only French survivors of Ravensbruck still alive today.
I miss them so much. They're still with me. They're with me a lot. They're still present.
Now, watching that highly moving report with me in the studio is Gwen Strauss, an American author living in France who wrote The Nine, an extraordinary true tale of 9 women, one of whom was her great-aunt, who escaped from a death march heading out of Ravensbruck. Gwen, thank you so much for your time. Why do we know so little about these women who effectively showed such amazing courage?
Well, partly, I think the women didn't talk about it afterwards. They were not encouraged to talk about it. They were, in fact, they were silenced. When they came home from the camps, they were sort of told, okay, you got the right to vote, which they got in 1945 for the work in the resistance, and that was seen to be enough. And there was a real push that these women would just go back to traditional roles and let's just forget about it. And also you have to remember that when the women arrived from Ravensbruck, it was a year after Paris had been liberated. So it was a terrible reminder for the people in Paris who felt like, okay, the war is behind us. And here arrives these emaciated, destroyed women who had been young, beautiful girls, and now, they don't even recognize them. So there was also it was horrific, and people didn't want to hear about it. And there was this idea, let's move on. It's time the war is over. Let's go back to the way that things were before. We just don't want to. And the other important thing to remember is that because Ravensbrück was a camp built only for women, the Germans themselves really wanted to erase it from history. And there was a real effort to erase all traces of it and to not talk about it. I mean, it was one of the most important concentration camps, and so little is known about it.
And what moved you to write the book?
Well, it was of sheer luck, or it was my great aunt. It was one day at lunch, and she was in her 80s at the time. I was with my grandmother, and Hélène was there, and she started to tell me this story, this extraordinary story. I'd never heard it. It hadn't been told in the family. She was married to my uncle Danny, who was a famous French resistance fighter, Daniel Benedict. And so that was the story we always told. And here she was telling me this incredible story, and I was just shocked. So I said, can I come back? Can I record it? Which I did with my aunt. And then I sort of let it go at that point. It took a long time. It was in my head, but I had children, I had a life, things were going on. And then I was, it was around 2016, I think, when there was some neo-Nazi marching in Charlottesville. That really upset me, and I thought I need to think about this story and write about it.
How did writing the book impact you personally?
Oh, it was an incredible experience. First of all, it was a lot of detective work, which I had never really done that kind of historical research. My aunt had told me the story, like I said, when she was 80. She hadn't really spoken of it very often, so there were big holes in her narrative. I didn't know how many women were in the group. I didn't know the names of the women. I had to figure all this out, and slowly, piece by piece, the pieces fell into place, and the names of the women and their incredible stories. And each one of these women, there were 9 of them, and they were from 21 to 29 years old. They were each extraordinary women who had all been in the resistance and had their own backstories. And so I just learned a lot also. I think it was the solidarity amongst the women was the thing that moved me the most. I just discovered again and again these stories of helping each other out. And I think that's why statistically women survived at much higher rates in the camps than men did.
And because of the way in which they formed this incredible bond and how friendship was at the very core
Absolutely.
of everything they did.
Absolutely. And they had all kinds of really amazing and beautiful ways of helping each other out. They had, for example, they recited recipes to each other. They're starving, and you wouldn't think this, but hungry people love to talk about food. And they would recite a recipe ingredient by ingredient, step by step, and they called that eating a meal together. They would gather around and listen to that. And they liked it so much that they would steal, at the risk of their lives, paper, and they would write down these recipes and pass them around. They made these recipe books. After the war, they kept that kind of hidden because they thought no one would understand. They would think it was kind of frivolous, but it was actually a way to share with each other their heritage, their family, their culture, what they ate. It was really kind of a beautiful way of being together.
And a lot of them, sadly, however, struggled with everyday life once they came back home, didn't they?
Absolutely. I think it's a lot like all soldiers and with PTSD, post-traumatic stress. I think it was hard that they weren't allowed to talk about what had happened to them, or they weren't encouraged to. So that this whole terrible trauma had to be kept pushed down. They weren't recognized. And also they had formed these incredible friendships, and then you don't find those again in life. I think Jacqueline talks about that. It's such a rare kind of closeness. You might not ever have that experience again. It's kind of counterintuitive, but I think they missed that bond. There's a loneliness.
As I've heard you say, we all ethically have the right to bear witness to these stories and pass these incredible tales on to younger generations, don't we?
Absolutely. I think so. And I think it's 80 years. That's really a whole memory. That's a generation. Jacqueline is one of the last survivors. So that living memory is going to die. And it's really, I think it's just so vitally important that we preserve that and we pass it on, because it needs to be remembered.
Especially at this point in
Absolutely.
time when we're seeing a rise in the far right and nationalist extremism. And we know that the end point of such politics is what we witnessed during World War II.
Absolutely. And also a rise of anti-women politics. It's really incredible, this backlash. You see, it all comes as one whole package, actually.
Gwen, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
And that's it for this edition. So until our next show, bye for now.